I'm delighted that you're with us tonight to learn more about the statues important to us in Lincoln Park. First of all, I want to let you know that this program is being recorded, and if you choose, you can watch it or share it with your friends after the evening. First of all, I would like to welcome our alderman from the 43rd Ward, Michelle Smith. All of the statues we're going to be talking about are in Alderman Smith's ward, in Ward 43, and she wanted to let us know about her love of Lincoln Park. Michelle?
Well, thank you so much, Vern. I really wanted to thank Gold Coast Neighbors for putting on this event and for their constant stewardship of our beautiful Lincoln Park and the Gold Coast. If you're not a member of Gold Coast Neighbors, I certainly hope you join, because the Gold Coast Neighbors work hard every single year on wonderful programs like this, as well as programs to help preserve our beautiful neighborhood. I think this is a great opportunity to learn a lot of things that maybe we'd forgotten or maybe really never knew. So I'm as excited as everyone else to listen to the great historians who are going to be joining us today to teach us about the meanings of these important monuments in our park. So thank you and welcome to this evening's event.
Thank you, Alderman Smith. We appreciate your support of our organization. I want to start by explaining the reason for the program. Perhaps you're aware that the City of Chicago and the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events has established the Chicago Monuments Initiative. And they are examining a set of monuments that have been identified for a lot of different reasons for review in light of today's sensitivities. This program tonight is to talk about the 6 of the 41 statues which happen to be in Lincoln Park near our neighborhood. Our intention tonight is not to determine whether or not those statues should be there or not there, or whatever should happen to those statues, but rather let's learn about those statues, the history of the person that's represented in the monument, as well as the background of why it was there and what's the current perspective about that particular public figure. So we're going to present the facts tonight, and we have 2 wonderful historians from here in Chicago who are going to help us understand a lot more about these 6 statues. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kim Dulaney, is the Director of Education and Programs from the DuSable Museum of African American History. Dr. Dulaney is a member of the staff there, and the DuSable Museum is celebrating its 60th anniversary as the first museum in the United States to focus on the history of blacks in America. It welcomes visitors to its exhibits of paintings, sculptures, print works, and historical memorabilia at the museum that's located in Hyde Park in Washington Park, across the street from the University of Chicago. Welcome, Dr. Dulaney. Our second panelist is Dr. Rose Miron, who is director of the D'Arcy McNickle Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library. The Newberry collection of millions of books, maps, and manuscripts illuminates more than 6 centuries of human history. Open to the public when the pandemic is over, right here in the Gold Coast, across from Washington Square Park. The Newberry has a commitment to research, inspiring learning, and using inquiry as a tool in a vibrant, democratic society. Welcome, Dr. Miron. Now, a little bit about both of our historians. Dr. Dulaney is also a professor of African American Studies at Chicago State University. Her concentrations are in the area of Black creative productions and popular culture, Black education, and identity construction. She has a doctorate in educational leadership and curriculum foundation from Chicago State University. Dr. Miron is also an affiliate faculty member of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies at Northwestern University. Her research explores Indigenous public history and public memory within the Northeast and Great Lakes regions. And she brings a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot more about these statues tonight. Welcome, both of you. Tonight we'll be taking a close look at the 6 statues in Lincoln Park near the Gold Coast, which were identified by the Chicago Monuments Project. Interestingly, all 6 were installed in the 10-year period from 1884 to 1894. So we need to learn a little bit more about that period in Chicago history. Dr. Miron, would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, Vern, and thank you to the Gold Coast Neighbors Association for having me. And I'll say, for those of you who are in the neighborhood, the Newberry is open now. So
good.
If you want to come see any of the materials, I'm going to talk about some Newberry materials tonight, so you can come see them in person. Before I jump into your question, Vern, about the 1880s and 90s, I'd like to just go back a little bit and talk a little bit about the land that the monuments that we're going to be talking tonight are on. Chicagowinak, or Chicagonge, or as we now know it, Chicago, has always been home to Indigenous people. And I think it's really important that we start with that recognition. The Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Odawa, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Miamia, the Kiwiki, and Meskwaki nations are all have all called the present-day city of Chicago home at different points prior to colonization. And each of these nations still considers present-day city of Chicago as falling within their ancestral homelands. Several other tribal nations, including the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Rasputin nations, also call the larger region of northeastern Illinois home. So, this land has always been and remains important to Indigenous peoples, many of whom still live in the city today. And I think that history matters because, as we're going to be jumping ahead to the 1880s and 90s, a period that's really defined by the so-called, closing of the frontier and the imagined disappearance of Native peoples. But I want to emphasize right away that Native people never completely left Chicago, and they've never relinquished their claims to this land. But by the 1880s and the 1890s, the United States, and more specifically the city of Chicago, was very interested in making it seem like that was the case. This was the moment at the turn of the century, beginning in the 1880s and the 1890s, but really extending through the first decades of the 20th centuries, that is really defined by transition and change. Western expansion by white settlers is slowing a little bit at this point. And after the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, people essentially declare the so-called Indian Wars over and the frontier as being closed. And at the same time, beginning in the 1880s, America begins this rapid period of industrialization and urbanization, and immigration surges, which creates a sort of identity crisis for the United States. So there's this renewed interest in finding something to unite the American people and to define a distinctly American identity. So it's really no surprise that we see lots of monuments of founders pop up during this period. White leaders like LaSalle, Ben Franklin, among others, were erected as a way of reminding people of the origins of the United States. And then more recent leaders like Lincoln and Grant helped to define a more recent American past. But then we see something distinctly different, which is this sharp rise in statues of American Indian people as well. Actually less often in alone or in groups of only Indigenous peoples like the statues that we're going to talk about tonight, but more often in scenes of settler colonial violence or founding narratives that sort of highlight this progression of white settlement against an imagined primitiveness or decline of Native peoples. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the alarm and signal of peace. But in short, the United States sort of grasps onto Native people as this romantic or almost mythological symbol of strength and bravery that represents a forgotten but longed for American past. And if you could go to the next slide, in Chicago in particular, the 1890s are in some ways really defined by the World's Fair, which is again framed as a celebration of the origins of the United States as a country and as a way of defining this shared heritage and thus a sense of nationhood among Americans. And certainly, this process isn't unique to the United States. A key pillar of nationhood is a shared sense of history and belonging. And that's really what we see happening during this period as the United States is sort of trying to define itself at the turn of the century. So in that sense, it's not surprising to me that we have this mixture of statues that all get erected across the same 20-year period. Each of them are aiming to define American identity in a unique way. And I'm going to pass it over to Kim now, who's going to be talking a little bit more about why we should care about monuments and why they're important.
Thank you, Rose. That was interesting information. You mentioned identity. At the beginning of all my African American studies classes, I teach this thing called Everything's an Argument. And so everything we see is an argument. It means something. Monuments are created to make a statement about the ideas, the values, and the individuals that we want society to know, remember, and honor. Some of the benefits are it makes us curious. It tells us about the times, the beliefs and culture. It helps us to kind of understand during that time what people thought was good or bad from the past and the present. It affirms our cultural values and concretizes our identity. Also helps to create a historical record. And I wrote something I wanted to read about that part of it. Monuments are rarely erected spontaneously or in a timely manner. Generally, people consider and weigh facts, then decide to memorialize people or events in accordance with the will of the people and the intentional and directed aims of the society. History is constantly being revised to broaden and add understanding. If monuments are to be used as historical markers or records, scholars suggest they too must be revised to reflect the broadening narratives. So, and more additive than deductive, more add to them to broaden the narrative. And so with that, I'll toss it to Vern.
Okay, thank you. That's a great lead in to what we're going to be talking about next, which is the specifics of the 6 statues. Our panelists will be discussing each of the statues on display in Lincoln Park. One panelist will give the background information on the statue, and the other panelist will share her perspective on the current views of that person. I'll introduce the conversation about each statue with a question or comment. And so we'll be starting with the first statue, and it happens to be from a French statue, a French explorer, Robert Cavelier de La Salle. And you might have noticed him on the corner of Clark and La Salle, and he's as they've positioned him, he's looking fondly down La Salle Street. Now, tell us a little bit more about him, Rose, if you'll give us a little bit of the background on this French explorer.
Sure, absolutely. So if we could go to the next slide. So La Salle was a French explorer, as Vern has already said, and a fur trader who led significant expeditions in the late 17th century. But he's best known for his 1682 expedition to the lower Mississippi, which is shown in green on the map that you can all see right now. Because it was this expedition, that led him to essentially claim the Mississippi River Basin for France. And I want to just position La Salle a little bit within this time period. He's one of several French explorers that's traveling through the American continent at this time. And it's really right in the heart of French and English colonialism in what will become the United States. And it's the actions of these settlers like La Salle that lead the French and British to sort of claim swaths of land. But I want to problematize that a little bit. So if we go to the next slide, this is a map from the Newberry's graph collection from 1681. So the same period as these explorations are happening. And it's showing this sort of unique view of the Mississippi River Basin. Chicago is down on the right side of the map where it says Lac de Michigamme. And the map stretches from the source of the Mississippi in present-day Minnesota, which is on the right side, to the Gulf of Mexico on the left side of the map. And I know it's a little hard to see, but most of the wording on this map is indicating the presence of native nations or native villages. So La Salle couldn't have really claimed the Mississippi River Basin for France. This is only a portion of it, and there are clearly people that are already living here. But it's not really the mindset that he and these explorers were operating in. They were actually operating under explicit instructions from the Catholic Church that were part of several papal bulls, one from 1492 that instructed Christian explorers to capture and enslave non-Christians, and another from 1493 that granted Christians right of conquest over land occupied by non-Christians. And these are collectively known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And that really became the framework for colonization for all major Christian European powers. So La Salle, who's exploring in the 17th century, is still very much operating under these policies. And his wishful sort of claiming of land is really based on what were becoming the pillars of colonialism. And I think just the other thing that I want to note about La Salle before I pass it over to Kim is that I think we hear so much about him and other French explorers. He's, the one who gets remembered. But if you read the accounts of his explorations, both throughout the Great Lakes and through the Mississippi, it's just peppered with references to Native people. La Salle and other explorers would have absolutely had Native guides. They met Native people who escorted them from place to place along their routes. And, quite simply, they just wouldn't have survived without building relationships with the Native people who they were very quick to dismiss as inferior to them because they were not Christian. So I think that larger context is critical when we think about somebody like La Salle and, what it means to celebrate him in this larger context of colonization.
Let me just add to that then, Rose. I'll add, is it my time now? Okay, I'll add. So that was great information. La Salle, a couple of things I'll add is that La Salle died in 1687. And then that monument wasn't erected until 1889. So that's a lot of time to consider who La Salle was and what he actually did, right? One of his last ship, he had 3 expeditions, 4 at the end of his kind of career, and 3 of them were not successful, whatever. And then the 4th one in 1995, that last ship, the La Belle, was found sunken off the coast of Texas. And off of it, they've gotten, like they said, 1.6 million artifacts from that sunken ship. But what's important to note is that what those artifacts tell people, and that is that La Salle wasn't, that he also employed violence in his colonizing efforts, right? And so it wasn't like just a friendly exploration. It was clearly to go over and take land, right? He even claimed that area that he's most popular for, the Louisiana Territory, to be put across there. And he also, I found it interesting though, that he wanted to be a Catholic priest, So he felt this was part of the calling. He loved excitement and exploring and things like that. But we can't erase the fact, by all accounts, he sounds like he was just adventurous and went around, except for this use of violence and imposing on other people's land and then taking it with might, with violence. And so the fact that he died in 1687, and then that monument was erected in 1889, is very telling about how we keep history and whose story gets told. So I found that to be pretty interesting.
All right, thank you. Well, of course, I want to emphasize that a review of history sometimes mentions things that we would not agree with today, and that is part of the purpose of tonight's discussion. So I want to emphasize that references to things that we are familiar with today may, of course, not be the thinking of different institutions that we mention. So the next statue that I'd like to mention is following along a little bit in history is the Benjamin Franklin statue. You'll note that is just north of LaSalle Drive, near just underneath an underpass in the very south end of Lincoln Park. It's on a high pedestal. It's a nice rendering of Benjamin Franklin, and most of us in grade school learned a lot about Benjamin Franklin. He was a scientist. He was the first postmaster general. He was an early librarian, and he was an early ambassador for the United States. And sounds like someone who we should have a statue for. What can you tell us about him, Dr. Dulaney?
Okay, I'm sharing my screen right quick to show
Sure.
you all something. So Benjamin Franklin was all of those things that you said. I wanted to share a couple of, I'm trying to bring the African-American perspective in this
Of course.
particular experience. And so he, as you said, he helped to shape American democracy. He did own slaves, even though that was the order of the day. So that wasn't that abnormal. Though the majority of people did not, a lot of people did. So that's kind of understood. I'm going to move this and just share some of Benjamin Franklin's own words. As we go through history, sometimes it's hard or things get misconstrued. So I always try to see what the person said themselves, what they can be said. So here are observations concerning the increase of mankind in the peopling of countries, etc. This is written by Ben Franklin. These are his points. And so much of it talks, we have limited time, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but much of it talks about how to build families and what's necessary in building communities and things like that, building families. I read the whole thing, but I was waiting to hear about what he felt about, African Americans, people of African descent. And so I highlighted that part. And then here in this section 12, he said, reckon then the interest of the first purchase. He was trying to explain that slavery isn't the most economical way to gain wealth. So he was comparing it with some other things in foreign markets. But then in this point, he said, reckon then the interest of the first purchase of a slave, the insurance risk on his life, the clothing and diet expenses, and his sickness and loss of time, lost by his neglect of business. This was very interesting to me. Neglect, then he says, neglect is natural to the man who is not to be benefited by his own care or diligence. So he was very practical. Everything he said was just very practical. Expense of a driver to help to keep him at work, and his pilfering from time to time. Manufacture of iron or wood in England, you will see that labor is much cheaper there than it ever can be by Negroes here. Why then will Americans purchase slaves, he says? Because slaves may be kept as long as a man pleases or has occasion for their labor, while hired men are continually leaving their master, often in the midst of his business, and settling up for themselves. That's what he said. This is all very pragmatic stuff. And then a little lower, he said, the introduction of slaves, the Negroes brought into the English sugar islands have greatly diminished the whites there. The poor are by this means deprived of employment, while a few families acquire vast estates, which they spend on foreign luxuries and educating their children in the habit of those luxuries. To some income is needed for support of that one might have maintained. The whites who have slaves not laboring are enfeebled and therefore not so generally prolific. The slaves being worked too hard and ill-fed, their constitutions are broken, and the deaths among them are more than the births, so that a continual supply is needed from Africa. The northern colonies having few slaves increase in whites. Slaves also pejorate the families that use them. The white children become profound, disgusted with labor and being educated in idleness and rendered unfit to get a living by industry. And then he suggests, he said, this is how he suggests the ideological grounding back then was. He said, hence the prince that acquires new territory, if he finds it vacant, or removes the natives to give his own people room, and then drop down, may be properly called fathers of their nation, as they are the cause of the generation of multitudes by the encouragement they afford to marry. So he's saying when people do that, they should be commended and should be revered and respected, because they make the space for um, the broadening of these families. So when they said, I saw mentioned several times that he was the father of democracy. This is why. That's kind of why. This is his own words that he wrote that. So I found that to be pretty interesting. And I'll toss it to Rose from there.
And Rose, did you have some comments about Benjamin Franklin?
Yeah. Sorry, can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, Kim. That was very interesting. Yeah, so Franklin, you know, like you said, had lots of thoughts about Native people and about Black people, essentially, you know, non-white people that he was interacting with. And he played a key role in Indian affairs in colonial America. Now, you know, if we compare him with other founders, his policies towards Indigenous peoples were more fair and just than other people. But if we look a little bit closer, it's still key that he was, you know, ultimately entwined with the intimate structure of settler colonialism. So, you know, like other founders, in his own writing, he repeatedly referred to Native people as barbarians and savages, you know, perpetuating this language that continued to advance principles of white superiority that were originally set out in the doctrine of discovery. And this framing of Indigenous people as inherently inferior meant that he, like other founders, believed in the inevitable replacement of Native people by Europeans and eventually by, you know, American colonists. And, you know, that's really the crux of settler colonialism. It's an effort to eliminate Native people and Native nations and replace them with white settlers. So Franklin believed in this, and he laid out treaty protocols in his Albany Plan of Union that would ultimately make that possible for the next century. Even though the Plan of Union ultimately wasn't accepted, the protocols that he laid out in that were ultimately adopted by Britain and then eventually by the United States in both the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Now, we can, and I would argue that the protocols that he laid out eventually collapsed as white settlers became greedier and treaty making became increasingly problematic. But, you know, he, in contrast, envisioned this protocol where Native land should be acquired peaceably. He recognized Native people as collective owners of the land and as sovereign nations. And he suggested that land should only be purchased by countries, so by the British and eventually by the American government, rather than by individual landowners. But he was still incredibly heavily invested in acquiring Native land. And his interest in this protocol was actually probably more about his own interests rather than the fact that this was actually a more fair way of doing things. So, you know, as an individual, he benefited from only Britain or only the United States being able to be the single purchaser of Indian land, because that meant that because of his status, he could seek patent rights directly from the British Crown to purchase several tracts of Indian land. And he did that. He purchased several tracts of Indian land after these policies were enacted in the Ohio River Valley. And so that principle of only governments purchasing Indian land wasn't really about treating Native people fairly for him. It just made it easier for him to purchase this land and to dispossess Native people because he was competing with less people to purchase the land. So, you know, that's all to say, Franklin certainly isn't the name that flies to the top of my list if I think about founders that dispossessed Native people of their land. But I also don't think that he's someone that Native people are particularly interested in celebrating or in celebrating his legacy. You know, he, like pretty much every other founder, was just embedded in this framework of settler colonialism. And he advocated for policies that he thought would most easily and peaceably allow for the dispossession of Native people and the advancement of white settlement.
Well, thank you. I do want to remind everyone that our purpose here is to present these famous people as being great Americans that they are. Certainly Benjamin Franklin did great scientific work and was very, very involved in establishing the United States of America. But what we're hearing is that there are some different perspectives on these famous people that have raised eyebrows and thus have been added to this review list for the Chicago Monuments Commission. So that is, of course, the purpose of what we're doing here tonight, is establishing what are those alternate views that people need to understand to have a full sense of the discussions about these monuments. The next two monuments are actually of Native Americans. Along the lakefront, there are two monuments, one called the Alarm and another one called a Signal of Peace. We'll start with the Alarm. I'd like to point out that this is the one of the 6 statues which portrays a woman in the statue, although she seems to be a lesser figure in the statue. But we would love to hear a little bit more about the origins of this statue. And Rose, could you tell us a little bit about this particular object?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to sort of talk about these two statues together, the Alarm and Signal of Peace, because they're kind of put up for similar reasons, but I'll talk a little bit about each of them. So these went up in 1884 is when the Alarm went up, and then 1890 is when Signal of Peace came up. And they're both meant to memorialize Native people in some way. So the Alarm was commissioned by lumber magnate and real estate investor Martin L. Ryerson, who was formerly a fur trader in Detroit. And he said that the statue was dedicated to, quote, the Odawa Nation of Indians, my early friends. And then if we go to the next slide, Signal of Peace, this statue was purchased by Lambert Tree, who actually is the same person that commissioned the statue of La Salle a year earlier. And he said the statue represented Indigenous people who were, quote, oppressed and robbed by government agents, deprived of their land, shot down by soldiers in wars fomented for the purpose of plundering and destroying their race, and finally drowned by the ever westward tide of population. And the Chicago Monuments Committee actually notes on their website that both of these pieces were, quote, meant to display respect for Native peoples amidst an era of atrocities. So I'm going to talk about some of those atrocities in a moment when we discuss the Lincoln and Grant statues. But in short, leading up to the time period that these statues are erected, Native people are literally being hunted in their own homelands. There are several absolutely brutal massacres of women and children, and Native American children are being forcibly taken from their homes and families and placed in boarding schools right up, and throughout this period. Signal of Peace, ironically, is actually put up the same year as the massacre at Wounded Knee, where more than 250 Lakota people were massacred by the US cavalry. So instead of honoring treaties made with Native people or allowing them to live in their homelands without violence or supporting the survival of Native languages and cultures, in other words, instead of attending to living Native people in any way during this period, the government and wealthy benefactors are putting up these statues of romanticized versions of Native people. And in the process, they're celebrating a sort of manufactured version of a Native past and erasing Native futures. And we see that really clearly in Tree's statement about Signal of Peace, where he acknowledges these atrocities, but says that Native people are being drowned out by this tide of civilization. And, again, as I talked about in the beginning of the program, this is very much roped into the sort of identity crisis that the United States is going through, and their attempts to appropriate Native people and culture really represents their longing for an American past and a shared sense of American nationhood. Native people during this period sort of provide a perfect foil for American progress and civilization, and they're often very literally used in statues and paintings to sort of contrast past with future. So the context in which these statues went up is really troubling. It's sort of this warped mourning of Native people that falsely positions them as disappearing, when in fact, at the same time, these brutal atrocities are continuing to be committed against living Native people, and the very culture that these statues are supposedly celebrating is being denied to living Native people. But if it's okay, I also just want to talk about sort of the lasting impacts of these statues, and more broadly, why these representations are things that people take issue with today. In the context of when they were put up, but also in these lasting representations, the statues really cement Native people into a particular time. And in doing so, particularly with Signal of Peace, you see this plain style headdress that's not representative of any Indigenous nations that lived or live in the Chicago area. And those representations feed into a version of Native people that's reinforced in things like mascots and popular culture. And it creates this sort of imagined idea of what Native people look like. That's simply not representative of the diversity of over 570 tribal nations within the United States. And these representations just make it incredibly difficult for Native people to ever be seen as, real Indigenous peoples. you end up with a lot of people who are meeting and working with Native people who end up saying, well, you know, you don't really look like a Native person to me, because they have these sort of images in their head of what Native people look like. And the argument, of course, then goes that if they're not real Native people, they don't deserve the rights that have that real Native nations and sovereign nations have. So the stereotypes have real consequences for Native people that are continuing to fight for these things. And then the last thing I'll say before I pass it over to Kim is just that, you know, study after study has shown that these types of representations are mentally damaging to particularly Native youth. There are high associations between depression, low self-esteem, and these stereotypes. You know, I sat on another panel for the Monuments Committee about the Bowman and the Spearman statues, and I'd encourage you to all to watch that recording, because I spoke with Dr. Katrina Phillips, who is enrolled at Red Lake Ojibwe Nation, and she talked about the fact that, you know, if she were to come to Chicago, she would go out of her way to not bring her children near those statues. And I think she would say the same things about these, because they're just stereotypical representations that can be very harmful. So, you know, that's all to say, I think we really have to think about who the representations are serving and for what purpose. And I'll leave it there for now and pass it over to Kim.
Wow. Okay, so I want to add to that. It's not much to add to that. So I just want to add just my thought about intention, that sometimes people can be well-intentioned, right? Like when I read that this is for my friends, and people erected these things thinking that they want to pay tribute to this population of people. But things can get lost in the minutia. So I also, in addition, one of my Black Studies classes that I teach is, I teach also cultural diversity. And I'm careful to engage the culture I'm talking about so that I don't filter it through my brain and impose my understanding on their cultural beings, right? Or cultural ways. And so I think that's an example of kind of what happened there. And so even when you look at the artists for those sculptures, the artists infuse European styles and things like that, nuanced things that in just the minutia of the detail, a person would render it inauthentic, right? So not a good representation, because I could say, like today, people sometimes create things in that for African Americans. They say, well, I use creative license. But for people who don't know or encounter or commune with African Americans, then we get frozen in the stereotype. So that's kind of, I understand what you said happened with that. And so it's just kind of a cautionary thing that even when we mean to do good, if we don't engage the actual person and give them that, you know, give them agency in it, then it can be more damaging than good. I'll toss it back to Vern.
All right, thank you, Kim. Our next statue is perhaps one of the most recent people in the group is the statue of Ulysses S. Grant. And you'll find that next to the lagoon off of Lakeshore Drive. Many of you have seen it from afar. I wanted to dig into that just a little bit myself. I happened last summer to take a trip out to Galena, and I learned a little bit more about General Grant and President Grant. And the statue itself has a real interesting history. Grant passed away in July of 1885, and this particular monument is the largest monument ever cast in America at the time. It's 8 feet high and weighs 8 tons. So it's quite a big piece of bronze. The gentlemen who are foremost in the work of funding it is a Gold Coast neighbor himself, Mr. Potter Palmer. And he, on the day of, after Grant's death in 1885, he contacted General Grant's or President Grant's chief of staff and said we should give him a monument because he was such a popular figure from Illinois. And Potter Palmer donated $21,000 that day to the Grant Memorial Fund. And within 3 days, they had tripled that amount to $65,000. And in today's economy, that $65,000 is worth $18 million in 3 days that they collected publicly for this particular statue to honor Grant within a week of his death. Looking at the statue itself, they specified that they did not want to have something that was idealized in this particular case. They wanted to have something that really looked like General Grant. I found a quote that was written in Harper's Weekly in 1891 when it was unveiled. And it says in Harper's Weekly that the trustees did not look toward ideality. They regarded the real with more favor. And if this monument is to last, Americans of the future will bless the inspiration that gave to posterity not a sculptor's dream, but a true and faithful picture of the man himself. So hopefully this one is more in tune with what he really looked like versus what we were talking about, the idealized versions of Native Americans or other explorers. So having said that about President Grant, there are some other views about his background and today's view of him. And I think we're going to start with Kim. I believe you're going to do some of the background. Is that correct?
Well, I can add a little bit. You did a great job. For Grant, in researching President Grant, I tend to think he must have been kind of a little better than the others because he was critiqued so harshly as being the worst. I know he was corrupt, he was corrupt. He was accused of mismanaging money, and all of his people supposedly mismanaged money. The newspaper, I think it was the New York Sun, called him the most corrupt president to ever have a seat in the White House. It seems that President Grant, he just came at the wrong time because for people of African descent in America, all basically it's summarized as so much was lost under Grant, right? Because after Lincoln died, and then so much that was happening, so many gains that had been put in place to shore up slavery during Reconstruction, like to repair during Reconstruction, all of those things were lost. During my research, I found that the Republicans lost the House of Representatives to the Democrats. And so that was why some of that happened. That was what, so it seems like some of it was out of his hands because he did create the Department of Justice to kind of try to curb the activity of the Ku Klux Klan against African Americans of the day. So that was a good thing. He also, what else did he do? He also upheld voting and civil rights for a bit. And so it seemed like he was trying to do good things. And again, because, I couldn't find, I was looking for an African-American source to to dig in deeper, to say what were the particulars that he could be tied to him. But I couldn't find anything. I just found general information, and general information was saying like that again, that he was the worst president to date, and that was because of his efforts to. It seemed like it was because of his efforts to kind of help maintain some semblance of gains for African Americans, but they did say that he was corrupt and that he was found to steal or something, things of that sort, they said, but I couldn't find anything in particular about African Americans other than the losses that happened during his presidency. Rose.
And Rose, would you like to pick it up from there?
Yeah, absolutely. Grant is well known within Native history for his 1868 peace policy, which sounds good, right? He was not interested in continuing extensive wars with Native people that happened under President Lincoln, and he wanted to sort of issue in this new era of peace. And so he devised this peace policy that distributed the management of Indian reservations to various Christian denominations. And, while I don't think it was his intention, this unfortunately really paved the way for what would become nearly a century of U.S. Indian boarding schools, the majority of which were run by these church denominations with the use of federal funds. And if you could go to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about those institutions because I know not everybody knows what they are. So the stated goal of these schools was to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. Children were forcibly removed from their communities and taken from their families at young ages and put in these institutions. And upon arrival at the institutions, their hair was cut, their very precious regalia and clothing, which is, the same kinds of things that we see depicted in a lot of the statues from this era, was taken from them, and they were dressed in these military-style uniforms that you can see in this photo. These before and after photos were really common as methods of propaganda. Disease and abuse were rampant in these institutions. Some of you may have actually seen today that in Canada, they discovered a mass grave of 751 bodies, most of them children, at a Canadian residential school, which is the equivalent of these US schools. And the US actually had double the number of schools that Canada did, and every single one of them has a cemetery. No, I want to be clear, the majority of these schools were not rolled out under Grant's presidency. So for the most part, he didn't oversee the actual creation of these institutions, but he was very much an assimilationist. He believed that Native people needed to be assimilated into American culture. And the peace policy also ultimately made that assimilationist agenda possible. I'll just say too, he was also very much willing to use violence to enforce the peace policy. He very quickly realized that not many tribal nations actually wanted to be confined to reservations or be assimilated. And I want to read a quote from him. He said, "Indians who will not put themselves under the restraints required will have to be forced, even to the extent of making war upon them, to submit to measures that will ensure security to the white settlers of the territories." So, in spite of his hopes and maybe his original intentions, we see some significant massacres underneath the peace policy. And he also certainly showed that he was willing to break this policy in the interest of acquiring more land. So if we go to the next slide, the most famous example of this is the claiming of the Black Hills. So the land base that's shown on the left here is the reservation that was created for the Oceti-Sakowin, which many of you probably know as the Sioux, which comprises the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people. And that reservation was created in the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. But in violation of that treaty, Grant sent General George Armstrong Custer to the Black Hills in 1874 to scout a site for a military fort and to explore the area's natural resources, namely gold. They found gold, of course, and there was this rising tide of white speculators that streamed into the area. So Grant at first tried to purchase the land. He wanted the Black Hills to be American land. The Oceti-Sakowin refused. This was, the center of their world, this sacred place. And so in 1875, Grant, with his cabinet, devised a plan that allowed officials on the ground to allow miners to enter the Black Hills in violation of the treaty, really actually hoping that this would provoke an armed conflict and allow the US military to retaliate and take the Black Hills in progress. Of course, I think we probably all know what happened at Custer's last stand. It was a rousing defeat for the US government, but eventually this was successful. The United States eventually overwhelmed Lakota people with violence, and the United States eventually illegally redrew the lines of this treaty, and the US government overtook the Black Hills. So that remains unceded territory today. And you can see now on the right side where these present reservations are, but the Black Hills have never been ceded by the Oceti-Sakowin, and the tribes have never accepted the settlement that they've been offered for this land because it was an illegal seizure. They've continued to maintain that, it was taken illegally by force and that it is tribal land. So, that of course happened under Grant. And I think, we've talked a lot about intentions tonight. I think this is a case where maybe his initial intentions were overwhelmed by his desire to continue to expand the American nation. So.
Thank you, Rose. And finally, we come to the last of the 6 statues that we're going to discuss tonight, perhaps the most famous statue. It's the standing Lincoln statue of Abraham Lincoln that faces North Avenue near Dearborn. You might be familiar with the fact that this is by Augustus St. Gaudens, and it is in fact acknowledged as one of the great statues of Lincoln and of any American president. It has been acknowledged as a very striking artistic vision of Abraham Lincoln contemplating the future, perhaps, and it is well received by all of us who live in our neighborhood. We probably all walk by it often or drive by it often and see it, and I'm always struck by the globes that are on the statue pedestal that actually have the entire Gettysburg Address written on them. So we would think that Abraham Lincoln would not have gotten onto the list of the monuments to be reviewed, but perhaps there's some reasons for that. And Dr. Dulaney, maybe you can help us introduce that statue, and Rose, you can tell us a little bit of the commentary.
Okay, so Vern asked a great question the other day, like who could not want a statue for Abraham Lincoln, you know? And so I thought that was very just pure. Let me say that Christina Schutt, an African-American woman, is the fifth and the first African-American to become a director of the Lincoln Library. So that's that just happened. So I found that to be interesting. I want to share my screen to show just a little bit about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln for African Americans is a very controversial figure. There's no one set opinion about President Abraham Lincoln. Some people really respect and admire President Lincoln, but I wanted to hear something from that day. So I'm not gonna read all this, don't be afraid. I wanted to show you all some things that Abraham Lincoln himself said, and I wanted to hear, to bring the African-American voice, we wanna hear from Frederick Douglass, what Frederick Douglass wrote about Abraham Lincoln. Frederick Douglass, this is a speech he gave. It was delivered on the occasion of the unveiling of the Freedmen's Monument. This was a monument that was paid for by formerly enslaved people of African descent in America for Lincoln. They used their own money to pay for a statue for Lincoln in 1876. And here's what Frederick Douglass is. His speech is very long, you know, he's very eloquent, great orator. But I just highlighted a few parts, and it's going to show you the complexity of understanding Lincoln for African Americans. And I just highlighted a few parts. We, the colored people, newly emancipated and rejoicing in our blood-bought freedom near the close of the first century in the life of this republic, have now and here unveiled, set apart, and dedicated a monument of enduring granite and bronze in every line featured. But here's an important part. The men of this, Frederick Douglass said, the men of this generation may read this, and those of after-coming generations may read. So he did this for this conference we're having tonight. He did this intentionally. He said, we fully comprehend the relation of Abraham Lincoln, both to ourselves and to the white people of the United States. He was preeminent, the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity in the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. In all his education and feeling, he was an American of the Americans. He came into presidential chair upon one principle alone, namely opposition to the extension of slavery. His arguments in furtherance of this policy had their motive and mainspring in his patriotic devotion to the intersex of his own race, to protect, defend, and perpetuate slavery in the United States where it existed. Abraham Lincoln was not less ready than any other president to draw the sword of the nation. He was ready to execute all the supposed constitutional guarantees of the United States Constitution in favor of the slave system anywhere inside the slave states. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master and to suppress a slave rising for liberty, though his guilty master were already in arms against the government. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. That's important. Knowing this, I concede to you, my white fellow citizens, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme, first, midst, and last. You and yours were the objects of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by force of circumstance and necessity. Then he goes on to say some other things. He calls him a friend, right? He calls him a great friend. And then, important, he said, he talks about this whole conflict of us dealing with what he did wrong, right? So he said, when he tarried long in the mountain, when he strangely told us that we were the cause of the war, when he still more strangely told us to leave the land in which we were born, when he refused to employ our arms in defense of the Union, when after accepting our services as colored soldiers, he refused to retaliate our murder and torture as colored prisoners, when he told us he would save the Union if he could with slavery, when he revoked the proclamation of emancipation of General Fremont, when he refused to remove the popular commander of the Army of the Potomac in the days of its inaction and defeat. Who was more zealous in this effort to protect slavery than to suppress rebellion? When he saw all this and more, we were at times grieved, stunned, and greatly bewildered. But our hearts believed while they ached and bled. Nor was this even at that time a blind and unreasoning superstition. So he's saying, Frederick Douglass is acknowledging he did these wrong things. But ultimately what Frederick Douglass said is still, he said, fellow citizens, I end as I began with congratulations. We have done a good work for our race today in doing honor to the memory of our friend and liberator. We have been doing highest honors to ourselves and those who come after us. We have been fastening ourselves to a name and fame imperishable and immortal. We have also been defending ourselves from a blighting scandal. When now it shall be said that the colored man is soulless, that he has no appreciation of benefits or benefactors, when the foul reproach of ingratitude is hurled at us and it is attempted to scourge us beyond the range of human brotherhood, we may calmly point to the monument we have this day erected to the memory of Abraham Lincoln. So he talks about the fact that people greatly appreciate, regardless of what he did wrong, just the fact that even if he wouldn't have did it, if he didn't have to, and all these other things that we know, still we gained freedom under him. Now, this is what Lincoln himself said. These are his own words. And his views became clear during the 1858 series of debates with his opponent in the Illinois race for U.S. Senate, Stephen Douglas, who accused him of supporting Negro equality. And Douglas, in their fourth debate at Charleston, Illinois on September 18, 1858, Lincoln made his position clear. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. He went on to say that he opposed Black people having the right to vote and to serve on juries or to hold office and to intermarry with whites. And he said that his first instinct would be to free all the slaves and send them back to Liberia. He organized people, and it wasn't well received by people of African descent when he tried to tell them that. So at best, President Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He made that clear. He was a moderate sympathizer at best. Nevertheless, he was appreciated for the quote unquote freedom Black people received during his presidency. And so, to just not take up all the time, I'm going to stop and let Rose have it there. But I just want people to know that people recognize that he was not a hero for people of African descent. though he did make freedom possible. So people can't bring themselves to completely bash him, because it's under his leadership that people got freedom. But they recognize that he was really concerned with white males and with preserving. Okay.
Thank you,
Rose.
Kim.
Okay.
Rose? And
Thank
you
you,
have
Kim.
some other ideas about Native Americans and their relationship to Lincoln.
I do, yes. So, like Grant, Lincoln is remembered by Native peoples for his policies that, again, whether he meant them to or not, led to increased violence against Native people. But before I go there, I want to talk first about the event that he's really most well known for among Native communities, and that is the execution of 38 Dakota men following the 1862 U.S.-Dakota War. So if we go to the next slide. The one after that.
That's
There we
the
go.
document that I presented.
So this is an artist rendering of that execution by the artist Travis Blackbird. And I'll just give a little bit of context here. So the US-Dakota War broke out after Dakota people had been forcibly confined to reservations in what is now Minnesota, and they were not allowed to hunt in their traditional lands. Food rations from the federal government were late, and Dakota people were literally starving. So their choices were essentially to die of starvation or to fight for their land back. And they chose to fight. So they attacked several white villages that led to this short war in 1862. At the end of the war, there were 303 Dakota people that were sentenced to death by Minnesota Governor Henry Sibley. Now, Lincoln reduced that sentence by quite a bit. He ultimately signed the execution for 38 Dakota men, but it was still the largest mass execution in US history, and one that has absolutely never been forgotten by Dakota people. On the day after Christmas, after fighting for their families and hoping that they would not starve, these 38 Dakota men stood together on a public scaffold in Mankato, Minnesota. Together, they held hands, they sang their death songs, and they were simultaneously executed to cheers from the crowd. And months after they were buried in a mass grave at the edge of the town, their remains were collected by area doctors, including William Mayo, who founded the Mayo Clinic, and used for scientific research. So you can imagine that with that legacy, lots of Dakota people and Native people in general have very poor memories of Lincoln and understandings of him today. So if we could go to the next slide. Beyond that single event, Lincoln's general approach to Indian affairs in the West was to allow Army generals on the ground to dictate Indian policy. So again, while it probably wasn't his intention, this led to pretty major atrocities that took place really beyond his control, but because he didn't set a more forceful policy. So on the left, you're going to see the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, an artist rendering of that, where US soldiers attacked a peaceful village of Cheyenne and Arapaho people along Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado Territory. At this event, 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women and children and elderly people, were killed. And following the battle, again, soldiers mutilated the bodies and paraded them through the streets of Denver. In the same year, Colonel Kit Carson starved Navajo people out of their territory in what is now Arizona and forced them to surrender, leading to what is now known as the Long Walk, which is a forced 300-mile journey from Navajo homelands in what is present-day Arizona to eastern New Mexico, along which hundreds of people died. So, I think I'll just say about both Lincoln and Grant, and probably LaSalle and Franklin as well. I think it's fair to say that those men may not have intended every consequence that came of their policies and actions. We can certainly say that they made decisions they made based on the time period and the context they were in, and that's fine. But I think we can and should recognize the outcomes and the legacies of those policies and reflect on whether or not we want to celebrate those policies and those legacies, because by continuing to erect statues and monuments of these people, whether we like it or not, we are celebrating those legacies. And so it's really those legacies, the impacts that we have to decide if we should be celebrating or not, and also think about what communities we're continuing to marginalize and perpetuate violence against by celebrating those people. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Well, this has been very informative discussion. For many of us, we had no idea of some of the background of some of the events and circumstances of the people that are portrayed, and we have a better sense of why some of these statues and monuments are now under question, And that was the purpose of informing us tonight of what could possibly be wrong with Abraham Lincoln or any of the other monuments. So I want to say thank you to Dr. Miron and Dr. Dulaney for bringing us all this information and background. It gives us a better sense of how to think about the upcoming discussions about these monuments. And we encourage all of the attendees to further expand their knowledge of these subjects by visiting both the Newberry Library and the DuSable Museum of African American History, both of which are right here in Chicago for us to learn from and appreciate from history. Kim, did you have one more thing to say?
Yeah, I was wondering, do we get final comments?
Sure, please. Okay.
So for me, Vern, I just wanted to point out that in this time when everybody's attention is turned to the African American experience, it is so interesting to me when we discuss monuments and all of these things, monuments as is, like without, contextualizing them and adding information, right? Other information, other broader stories. It's interesting to me, the patterns, right? So for our historic patterns is to celebrate oppressors, right? We do. We celebrate conquerors, and even if murder was included. And for African Americans, the current trend is to celebrate the murdered. So we celebrate historic murderers and then murdered African Americans. It's quite troubling. It's quite troubling. And I think we have to have more information because we don't know the histories, right? So we seem so divided because we don't know each other's stories. So I think it's important. And thank you for inviting us and for being so patient and willing to hear these other perspectives.
Well, I think it's important that we take a scholarly view of these important historical facts. So thank you very much, both of you. Thank you to those who have joined us tonight as audience members. The Gold Coast Neighbors appreciates your attention. We request that those who are not members of Gold Coast Neighbors to consider joining our organization. This history and education event is only part of what we do. We have a mission involved in beautification, in zoning and business development, in safety, and these are all important aspects of what we do as Gold Coast Neighbors. As part of beautification, we've joined forces with the Chicago Parks Foundation and in their program for Pitch In for the Parks to take care of the Lincoln Park and the southern tip of Lincoln Park. And so we're sponsoring monthly cleanups in the park. And yesterday we had the first cleanup and we had a great turnout of volunteers to help keep that park beautiful, which is, after all, the backyard of the Gold Coast. Another way of deeper involvement with Gold Coast Neighbors in the community is attending some of our events. And I'm pleased to say that we will be holding Evening on Astor this in September. But this year, differently, it will be Evening on Astor on Division Street, where there is going to be, throughout the rest of the year, a closed block where we can gather together that is will be convenient for all of the festivities of the Evening on Astor event. So I look forward to bringing you more information about that in the coming months. And so from the Gold Coast Neighbors Association, we wish you a pleasant summer visit to Lincoln Park and good night. Thank you very much.